Good afternoon, everybody. Very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Natalie Fenton. I'm chair of the Media Reform Coalition and also Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths, University of London. This event is co-sponsored by a range of wonderful independent media, including the Byline Times, Now Then Festival of Debate, the Media Fund, Bywire and The Canary. And today we are discussing democracy's greatest threat, the Murdoch's right-wing propaganda machine in the US, UK and Australia. And it's hard to imagine any single individual who's had more influence on our media environment, from climate change denialism in Australia to cheering on alt-right-wing slogans in the US and hosting coronavirus misinformation globally. The Murdoch empire has championed virtually every reactionary cause going. Such is the reach of its propaganda machine that Rupert's own son, James Murdoch, left NewsCorp in 2020, declaring that the Murdoch outlets obscured facts and legitimised disinformation, while the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, has called Murdoch's media empire a cancer to democracy. And in spite of rampant criminality exposed in the Murdoch-controlled newsrooms on both sides of the Atlantic, NewsCorp continues to enjoy unrivaled access to some of the most senior figures in government. In the UK, last year, research found that the Murdoch and his senior executives met with senior ministers and officials in government over 200 times in just 24 months. That was research done by Hacked Off. In 2018, in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority advised the government against allowing Murdoch to gain control over Sky News, citing threats to the public interest over media plurality. Ofcom, our Office of Communications regulator, acknowledged what they called disturbing evidence of corporate failure within the Murdoch empire. Yet that very same organisation, Ofcom, has recently granted a licence to Murdoch to broadcast a new UK television news channel. So it seemed to us like this was a very good time to reflect more closely on the impact and influence this particular media mogul has had on our politics, our cultures and our democracies. And we have three fantastic speakers from around the world to help us do this. We have, and I'll introduce them briefly and then hand over to them to open up the conversation. Firstly, we have Justin Schlossberg, who is an Assistant Dean in the Department of Film and Media and Cultural Studies at Birkbeck University in London. Justin is a long-time friend and former chair of the Media Reform Coalition and co-founder and research director of a brilliant organisation called Truth Defence that has just published some really fantastic work actually on the general election 2019 and the circulation of misinformation that I would really recommend people have a look at. He's also written many other fantastic books, most recently one that he's co-authored with myself and Des Friedman and Lena Denchik called The Media Manifesto. All of his work connects around issues of media ownership, ethics and justice. And Justin will be talking about Murdoch from a UK perspective. And then we have the wonderful Benedetta Bravini, who is a journalist, media activist, and again, a long-standing member and supporter of the Media Reform Coalition. She's now involved in the campaign in Australia to end Murdoch's media dominance, a campaign that took many of us by surprise and is really gaining traction. Bene's an Associate Professor of Political Economy and Communication in the University of Sydney, and she's author of many books, including Public Service Broadcasting Online, editor of Beyond WikiLeaks. Her latest volumes are Carbon Capitalism and Communication, Confronting the Climate Crisis, which of course is a big deal in relation to Murdoch's influence, Climate Change in the Media, and most recently, Amazon, Understanding a Global Communication Giant. And then we're delighted to invite, and of course, Benny will be talking from Murdoch from an Australian perspective. And then we're delighted to also have with us Rhys Peck, who's an assistant professor at City University of New York. His research examines the areas of populist political rhetoric, television news, and tabloid media. He's the author of a wonderful book called Fox Populism, Branding Conservatism as Working Class, a book in which he shows how Fox News succeeds in hailing its audience as the real Americans. and thereby representing narrow conservative demands as popular and universal, and something I think we can all identify with in the UK in terms of much of our tabloid press. These wonderful speakers are going to be giving their views and ideas for about 10 minutes each, and then we will hand over to you for a Q&A session. So please do type your questions in as the speakers are presenting, and we will pick up as many of those as we possibly can at the end. So first up, we're going to turn to Justin Schlossberg to give us the UK perspective. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks very much, Natalie. I should just offer a pre-warning that I'm liable to interruption by Litlands at any point, so apologies for any inconvenience that may cause. What I wanted to just start off by talking about is really this question of where the problem resides, or where the problem that we should be addressing as academics, as activists, as citizens in relation to the Murdoch phenomenon. And I'd like to suggest that we shouldn't be concentrating on Murdoch himself, notwithstanding, as Natalie pointed out in the introduction, the very serious failures, ethical transgressions, and criminality that has been rampant in Murdoch-controlled newsrooms on both sides of the Atlantic, in fact, in other places in the world too, over recent decades. The problem that we really need to address is the failure of governments, of elected representatives, and of regulators to actually do anything meaningful to keep Murdoch's power in check. And in particular in the UK, what we're dealing with at the moment is the complete passivity of our converged media regulator on this issue, and a government that is clearly almost wholly captured by Murdoch's interests. To give you an insight, I think we should cast our minds backwards to 2010, the year that Murdoch first tried to establish his footprint on British broadcasting and television news in particular, with the proposed buyout of Sky, then called British Sky Broadcasting, by his NewsCorp. Ofcom did what's called a public interest test in relation to that proposal. And apart from raising concerns about how the merger would impact on the public interest from the perspective of plurality, Ofcom did something quite extraordinary in that report, something that I've never seen it do before or since, which is it used the report as an opportunity to tell the government that the current framework for regulating media ownership and plurality in particular in this country is not fit for purpose. Quote, "A public interest consideration can only be triggered by a specific corporate transaction. The current statutory framework may therefore fail to deliver its public interest objectives if plurality in the UK is significantly reduced by developments that do not arise from a specific corporate transaction involving media enterprises." And it added, quote, "We believe there may be value in providing for intervention where plurality concerns arise in the absence of any transaction involving media enterprises and which are not safeguarded by the current media ownership rules." What Ofcom was telling the government here in no uncertain terms is that the fundamental weakness with the existing system for regulating plurality was that it only responds to proposed mergers and acquisitions. It doesn't deal with, for example, the accumulation of power that can result in investment in already existing media outlets and platforms, or indeed investment in starting up or entering a new market. Now, that is significant for a number of reasons. It's particularly significant because, as well as this explicit call to the government to act on reforming the framework, what was equally unprecedented was just how much consensus there was in response to that call. So not only was it endorsed subsequently by the Lord Select Committee on Communications in their report into media ownership, it was endorsed by Lord Leveson in his inquiry into the ethics and practices of the press, and it was endorsed even by the government in DCMS's response to Ofcom. Basically, everyone agreed that there needs to be a fundamental change in the way that we regulate plurality, and that change should consist in regular reviews of the existing media ownership landscape in the UK. That led to all sorts of back and forth communications between Ofcom and the government, culminating in the unveiling in 2015 of a plurality measurement framework, which Ofcom proposed as the basis for carrying out these reviews and deciding simply whether or not there is sufficient plurality in the UK at any given time. And it was at that point that the policy completely stalled. There was no further action from the government, and Ofcom itself went completely quiet on it. And suffice it to say, there's never been a use of that measurement framework, and there's never been a plurality review outside of a proposed merger and acquisition. And I think it's really important for us to ask the question, why? Why did the policy stall? Now, we cannot say for certain that it stalled because Murdoch didn't want it to happen. What we can say for certain is that there is literally no one, no individual, no corporation that enjoys the level and exclusivity of access to the most senior figures within government than Rupert Murdoch and his family and his senior corporate executives. And we can speculate reasonably that when you have that degree of access, unchecked at all, by the way, as a result of the Leveson inquiry and Leveson's findings on the serious dangers to democracy posed by these sorts of intimate relations between political media elites, unchecked by anything that has resulted from the fallout of the phone hacking scandal, the scandal surrounding sexual harassment, and all the other controversies that have plagued Murdoch newsrooms since. We can only assume that that kind of access bears some kind of fruit. And we could ask reasonably the question, why would Murdoch not want the UK to have regular plurality reviews? Well, I can think of two fairly obvious ones for a start. One, implicit in the idea that the regulators should actually review the existing media landscape to determine whether there is sufficient plurality, is an acknowledgement of the possibility that the status quo isn't working, that the existing ownership landscape, it does not deliver us a sufficiently plural media environment to safeguard the most basic democratic concerns. And that means that Murdoch's existing interests, as well as those of other proprietors, could be under threat. But the second reason why this would really not be at all advantageous to Murdoch's interests is that there has to be, from Murdoch's perspective, a workaround in case the existing regulatory framework stops him from realizing his ambitions to perennially expand his media interests. And indeed, that's exactly what happened in 2017 when he tried again to buy out Sky, this time under the structure of 21st Century Fox, and was scuppered. Was scuppered primarily, I should say, by the Competition and Markets Authority. Ofcom, although again finding serious concerns in relation to the public interest by this deal, was relatively soft in opening the door to potential remedies that could be an easy workaround for Murdoch. The CMA was much tougher, and it all went badly wrong for Murdoch. He didn't get the green light that he was expecting. So what was the response? Well, just come back and launch his own television news channel. And the reason he knows he can do that is because there is no framework for regulating the existing landscape, because it's limited to mergers and acquisitions. So what I think all this really speaks to is the danger of a power structure as it exists in Britain today, where there is endemic capture of politicians and regulators by dominant corporate interests. The pandemic that we're living through right now has, in my view, undoubtedly been exacerbated by the government's failure to resist exactly these sorts of pressures. But we can only really understand those pressures in the context of the particular power wielded by media groups and the relatively unique grip of Britain's mainstream press on public debate and public consciousness. It's not just the airports and the airlines that have been constantly telling the government not to lock down or to open up sooner. It's also the constant stream of headlines in what is the bulk of the mainstream press, which is the kind of right-wing conservative press, dismissing or belittling experts, demanding holidays, summer holidays, and just gradually drip feeding this narrative that the COVID emergency has been exaggerated, that lockdowns don't work, etc., etc. The last thing I wanted to just say was that this is not a uniquely Tory or Conservative problem. Indeed, one of the most fascinating things about British political history over the last 40 years is that the only Prime Minister who has genuinely resisted Murdoch's lobbying power was a Conservative one. That was John Major. Interestingly and ironically, often cited as the weakest Prime Minister in Britain's modern political history. That's why I think it's so important that in our campaigns to resist Murdoch, we reach across partisan lines. And recent history also suggests this is one issue where we can really make a difference. We successfully blocked the last two attempts by Murdoch to consolidate his power over UK television news. Now, we might not be able to start his latest attempt, given that Ofcom already green-lighted a license for News UK TV under the cover of the pandemic, I should say. But Murdoch's deep access has to be challenged, and we need a comprehensive review of the media regulation landscape in this country. And the fact that Murdoch is coming back with this new television channel is a way in which we can expose the holes and inadequacies of the current regime. And I'm afraid that until we do that, Murdoch's deep access into the heart of Downing Street, the government's recurring weakness in the face of enormous corporate lobbying and pressures, is unlikely to be anything other than business as usual. Thank
you very much, Justin. I'm going to hand straight over to Benedetta Bravini to tell us about her experience in Australia, and in particular how that campaign is going, and any lessons we can learn in the UK. Thank you, Bene. Over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. I think that Australia is a fascinating case, really, to give even more relevance to what Justin was just saying about the UK case. And in fact, I really think it's an incredible case study to show really the effect of media concentration and the detrimental effect of media concentration on the democratic life of a country and on a healthy public sphere. Now, I just want to start by giving you an idea of the level of concentration, because I remember quite well when we were doing the campaign during the Levison inquiry that at that point, NewsCorp was controlling in the press market reaching about 30% of the market. But in Australia, NewsCorp owns actually more than half the newspaper market at about, according to our recent calculations, 53% at the moment. But it doesn't end there, because actually it also owns Foxtel, the monopolist in subscription television services, which is controlled by NewsCorp with a stake of 65%. And on top of this, with an 18 audience share, on top of this, there are many arrangements so that, for example, Sky News can be broadcasted for free by other by other TV channels that are free to air. So this control, which is unprecedented, actually, also for the Murdoch empire in one country, is exerted at the moment when the press is in dire state. In fact, we had two major inquiries that showed that about 106 local and regional newspaper titles closed between 2008 and 2018, a 15 decrease in the total number, and 3,000 to 3,200 journalism jobs were lost between 2012 and 2017. So what happens to a country when a media company has such unparalleled control over media markets? In my view, and Justin agrees clearly on this, you have two issues. You have the issue of excessive political, economic, and ideological power in the hand of the same company, but you also have the issue of an unparalleled capacity to interfere then on policy making, and specifically on media, on the media policy agenda. And I just want to give you very briefly two examples of how this is happening and how the Murdoch media are controlling and really impacting and dictating the political agenda, but also and specifically the media policy agenda. I think that actually it's very interesting because I get many calls lately to debate and to talk about two issues. Of course, one was the horrible bushfire season that burned around 12.6 million hectares across Australia between November and March last year, and killed about 1.2 billion animals and emitted 434 million tons of carbon emission. And all scientists agreed that these fires, these mega fires, are linked to climate change. And yet, in my study on bushfires coverage by 4 Australian outlets owned by NewsCorp, and we did this study from the 1st of December 2000 and from November, so it was late November, and the 21st of January 2020, and we found that only in less than 30% of the coverage, climate change is considered the cause. And other reasons were instead advanced, and the most common was land management, the problem with land management, and sometimes even arson, or sometimes even the policies of the Green Party. So, and moreover, what we found was that in a science and environmental story is more than twice as likely to quote a politician rather than a scientist, which is a further indication of the deeply politicized approach to coverage of the science. And I think I'll never forget one of the major headlines that is still resonating in my memory, which was from the Courier Mail, of course, owned by NewsCorp, that said, "Burning is not climate driven." And this research that we just did is very consistent with another study that has just been published by Get Up called How NewsCorp Produces Climate Skepticism in Australia. And again, it was across 4 NewsCorp publications, the Daily Telegraph, the Sun, Courier Mail, and Australian, between April 2019 and March 2020. And overall, they found that 45 of all items either rejected or casted doubts upon consensus, where there is scientific consensus about climate change. And what is very interesting and also is substantiating my finding is that nearly 2/3 of opinion pieces were all skeptical towards climate science. And no wonder that the Climate Action Network 2020 Climate Change Performance Index ranked Australia the worst in the world of climate change policy out of 57 countries. Except that probably if people are logging in from Australia, they wouldn't know about this, because I could only find a story published by The Guardian and one published by the other commercial competitor, Nine, and the 4 NewsCorp publications did not talk about it. And we know that silence is a very powerful weapon, and it's been constantly used by the Murdoch press when they don't want a debate to take place. But as I mentioned, there is more. There is this constant influence that has been taking place for years in this country, and the idea that the Murdoch press can dictate the media policy agenda. And this is really why it is so difficult for us also to change media systems and to achieve reform. And I mean, I mentioned that Australia was in global headlines recently, precisely because of the media bargaining code. And so the draft code, if adopted, will allow eligible Australian media organizations to bargain with Google and Facebook to secure fair payment for their news content. And the code isn't mandating how much should be paid, but rather is providing a compulsory negotiating process. And of course, established news outlets will have an advantage. And of course, there is absolutely no indication about how to use the money. And it's impossible not to see in this a policy that was absolutely wanted by the Murdoch empire, to get a substantial advantage, to get more resources. But certainly, this is not becoming a policy that can address the problem of media concentration of the country. And I was just reading the news a couple of hours ago, and it seems that it will pass even possibly next week on Tuesday. So I know that Murdoch is going to win this battle against Google, and it has absolutely a global impact. But I am optimistic because, as you said at the beginning, Natalie, we finally have a Senate Media Diversity Inquiry. And in the history of reform and media reform movements, as we know, we never heard of a petition on media diversity that collected 500,000 signatures calling for a royal commission into NewsCorp Australia. And this is clearly an indication that there is a great public concern about the role that NewsCorp plays in climate change and other political debates. So, in fact, it's really not the first time, because we had, and I counted, about 9 prominent inquiries since the 80s. But I think that this time is different, and this is why I tend to be hopeful, because this year the Murdoch media have campaigned, as we know, all around the world, and I'm sure that we hear from Reese about this from the US, against public health measures to curb the spread of COVID-19. But, like from borders closures to lockdowns and wearing masks everywhere in the world. But people also paid attention this year because of the immense help that Fox News gave to Trump, and now turning on him. So again, I think that this has really made people more aware of what's going on. And the campaign obviously is just at the beginning. And we will start with the Senate hearing on the 19th, so very soon. And we really hope, Natalie, we will have a voice.
Thank you very much, Bene. I hope so too. And I feel very much the same in the UK, that there is a new sensibility amongst people around the role of media dominance and certain companies' dominance of our kind of media ecology and how that influences public conversation. And I'm now going to hand over to Reese Peck, who is going to give us his views on the influence of Murdoch in the US. And you probably have more experience than many on this with Fox News, Reese. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for including me in this. This is such a great discussion. I think I'm going to take a kind of more of a messaging kind of approach to Fox News that I hope complements the excellent political, economic, and regulatory analysis that we've already heard. So last summer, 2020, Fox News hit a historic milestone. It not only beat out its liberal media competitors, CNN and MSNBC, and something that's done for nearly 2 decades, its audience grew so large that it eclipsed the broadcast networks, making it the #1 channel in all of American television. So Fox News earns over $2.5 billion annually and is the most valuable asset in Rupert Murdoch's global media empire. And this is to say nothing of the immense political impact that it has. So over the course of this 25-year history, Fox News has demonstrated both its intention and its ability to help Republicans gain conceptual control over a range of key national issues, from the Lewinsky-Clinton scandal and Clinton's subsequent impeachment, to the 2000 election, to the Iraq invasion, to their framing of the late 2000s economic crisis with the Tea Party. And so as I like this quote from Arlie Hochschild. She writes in Strangers in Their Own Land, "In American society, Fox News stands, quote, next to industry, state, church, and the regular media as an extra pillar of political culture all of its own." And I would add, as someone that grew up in a red state of Utah, this is especially the case in the red states. Where Fox News is headed at this precarious juncture of its history is uncertain, and one can only speculate when and if Fox News will lose its title as conservative America's main news source to upstarts like Newsmax and OAN. What is certain, however, is the central role that Fox News has played in spearheading the conservative media revolution of the last 2 decades, and at a deeper level in transforming how news is presented and marketed in the United States. The example of Fox News's breakout success demonstrated a domino effect, since it encouraged other news outlets, namely MSNBC, to adopt a partisan branding approach as well, and with that, a model of programming that favors opinion-based news over the straight, dispassionate news of the past. How did Murdoch turn Fox News into this financial powerhouse and this political juggernaut? Well, most analysts attribute Fox's success to the network's conservative ideological orientation. But breaking with this conventional take, I argue that Fox's style is as important to its rise as its ideology. Murdoch, with the help of founding CEO Roger Ailes, built Fox's iconoclastic news brand by combining 2 class-based traditions of public culture, one native to the political field in populism and the other native to the commercial media field in tabloid entertainment. Now, Donald Trump, a reality star come populist politician, embodies this tabloid populist synthesis through and through. But Trump is less the trigger and more the capstone of a populist discursive trend that Fox News set in motion decades before Trump became a political player. So to have a comprehensive understanding of Fox News, then we need a framework that can explain this relationship between the network's style and its ideology. Specifically, we need to better understand how Fox has used style as an ideological tool for popularizing the tenets of Murdoch's conservative economic dogma. So, privatization, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, trickle down. So when thinking about Trump's style and its connection to Murdoch, I find myself returning to journalism scholar James Curran and Gene Seaton's striking description of Murdoch's London tabloid, The Sun. They write that The Sun had this editorial formula that was both hedonistic and moralistic, iconoclastic and authoritarian, generally conservative in its opinions and radical in its rhetoric. One would be hard-pressed to come up with a more precise definition of Trumpism than that. So as my fellow panelists have already hinted at in their own studies of different national contexts, Fox's news style to a large extent is of foreign import, ironic for a network that's known for its patriotic Americanism. Indicative of the company's non-American origins, some of NewsCorp's first hit TV shows in the States, Current Affair and America's Most Wanted, were modeled after successful programs in Australia and in the UK. In addition to importing these reality genres on Fox Broadcasting, it is with Fox News that NewsCorp would introduce to the American public a distinctly British formulation of tabloid news. Of course, America had its own long tradition of tabloid journalism. Since the inception of the commercial news industry in America, it has been structured around these two opposing poles, the class-based media sectors, one quality and one tabloid. What Murdoch and Fox News added to this equation was to partisanize this historic market divide, which is to say to reframe it through a left-right prism. So in doing this, Murdoch helped normalize this idea that if you're an ordinary working class American who is turned off by the elitist tone of mainstream journalists, then naturally you must be a conservative. So in the early 90s, there was actually a host of conservative TV projects that came right before Fox News that few, if any, remember. The failed conservative networks like Newt Gingrich's National Empowerment Television were ideologically coherent, but were not aesthetically appealing to a broad audience. So think like a right-wing PBS. On the other hand, Murdoch's early American tabloids, such as A Current Affair, were commercially popular, but had no political import due to their strictly soft news orientation. The New York Post, which Murdoch acquired in 1976, emulated the partisan tabloid mix of his Australian and British newspapers, but as a print outlet lacked the reach of television. With Fox News, Murdoch had really cracked the code. Fox was a nationally distributed television channel that exhibited all the signature traits of the tabloid tradition: colorful presentation, graphic images, moralistic language, emotional directness. And unlike A Current Affair, though, it used serious editorial agenda centered on hard news topics like the economy, foreign policy, etc., elections. So using this potent mix of conservative populism and tabloid taste, Murdoch's Fox News was able to shape everything in America, from voting behavior to congressional legislation to general public knowledge. Particularly, we see this with the COVID crisis. So always in a way that advantages Republicans. So what do we do about this? I don't have a definitive answer, but what I do know is the liberal response in America has been mostly an abysmal failure. Rather than challenging the right by advancing an alternative populist narrative or by building a news channel that could surpass Fox in popular appeal and cultural relevance, American liberals prefer a more passive-aggressive approach to defeat the conservative opposition. The liberal strategy seeks to fix the U.S. media's informational culture by reasserting the tenets of professional journalism. This way, political disputes can be once more decided by facts and third-party experts. In such an ideal media environment, liberal journalists will not need to directly take on the right-wing media ecosystem. It will die off on its own accord as the public comes to view its reporting as erroneous and untrustworthy. By this logic, Murdoch, Fox News, and Fox host Sean Hannity in particular would have to pay a steep reputational price for the misinformation they helped spread in the critical early stages of the COVID-19 crisis. But if history is any judge, I doubt they will. Too often, liberal analysts adopt a limited informational conception of Fox's political communication strategies. But by only focusing on how Fox deceives its audience with bad science and misinformation, the analyst is distracted from seeing how the network actually derives its cultural authority. So the style being exuded by any given news outlet, whether it be Fox News or MSNBC or Democracy Now!, is as substantive to the formation of its political identity as its ideology alone is. So hence, to a large degree, Fox's style is its politics. So to move the discussion on conservative media forward, communication scholars and activists must not only address questions of bias and facticity, but also to think beyond them. More consideration should be given to the persuasive power of moral rhetoric and to the emotional identitarian pull of aesthetic presentation. Otherwise, we get trapped in this endless game of biased finger pointing, whereby a media partisan like Sean Hannity defends his coronavirus coverage by simply countercharging that it is his academic critics, not him, who live in a world where politics trumps truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reese. I'm going to bring everybody back in now. We've had a fantastic discussion. I don't know where Justin's gone, but hopefully he'll join us in a minute. We've ranged from thinking about media regulation frameworks in the UK and the necessity of having adequate plurality, media plurality regulation, to a discussion of just how impactful media coverage of climate change has been in Australia, to that really important point being made by Reese about the style of these news outlets and the influence that can have across the board in the types of political conversations we are able to conduct in our media environments. There's a range of questions that are coming in, and I'm going to ask one that came in from a couple of people. I think it was Mel Hopkins, and also I believe it's Elizabeth Misen. Hello, Elizabeth, who are asking, how do we actually counter the Murdoch power? And will it, in particularly in relation to the News UK channel, will a call for brands to boycott their ad spend work? Is that a useful tactic? And maybe because it's UK based, can I ask you, Justin, to respond to that immediately?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it relates to the broader question, which I think has also been raised by some people about, or rather the kind of defense that is used, that we shouldn't sort of prejudge this channel before it's launched, and that maybe somehow unexpectedly it delivers some kind of quality journalism or news service to rival that of the other major broadcasters. I think, to be honest with you, which follows on from the points I made in my opening remarks, we should try not to think of this as a problem exclusively to do with Murdoch, as a problem exclusively to do with News UK TV. This is a much wider problem, and is a problem fundamentally to do with the failure of regulation. Now, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't wholeheartedly support any kind of populist campaign, for example, to try and pressure advertisers not to support these channels, to expose the full extent of the corruption and criminality that has been endemic in Murdoch-controlled enterprises for decades, and indeed the as we've heard from Reese and Bene, the endemic racism, misogyny, and hate speech that underlies so much of the narratives that come out of Murdoch-controlled newsrooms. That is something that we should absolutely encourage and support, but we shouldn't do so at the expense of the bigger problem. This is fundamentally to do with a problem about media power, and as it is wielded by the likes of Murdoch, as it is wielded by the tech platforms, and as it is fundamentally, as our elected representatives routinely and recurringly fail to resist.
Thank you, Justin. I've got another question here. I think there are so many issues involved here, because it's not just about media plurality regulation, which is of course vital, but it's also about how we can object to the sorts of things that are also included in that media content now. How are we able to stand up against some of this rhetoric and to say, sorry, I've got very bright sunshine coming in, I'm going to block out. How can we then actually complain when the content is such that we feel it is overstepping the mark and it's not impartial in terms of broadcasting? So we also need regulation that allows us to do that. And in the UK, now we have Ofcom, who is supposed to help us ensure we have impartiality in our news broadcasts. But there's a real debate running over that, of whether that's actually working. Is Ofcom now fit for purpose? And particularly if we're going to get a new chair of Ofcom as the former editor of the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre, then that opens up a really big new question mark for us about how Ofcom is able to function effectively to counter that kind of tabloid-esque type of broadcasting that Reese has spoken about so eloquently in the US. I've got another question here coming from Jeanette Fletcher. Looking to the future, she says, Murdoch is not a young man. She's being very polite. What are the predictions for the direction NewsCorp will take once Murdoch is no longer at the helm? Now, bearing in mind that it's, Justin's important point, that this is not just about Murdoch, but Bene, maybe over to you.
Yes.
That's
well, I think that we all made the point that the problem is structural and it's really not just about Murdoch. But the reason why I tend to be optimistic with this inquiry, that I just want to remind you, it's basically just starting, because the submission ended in December and the report will be submitted by August. And so the hearings will take place in the next weeks and months. Depending on how many there would be. But I think that actually there is a point about also Murdoch per se, because we know that it's also the perception of the charisma, the perception of his power that is leading very often to many politicians to behave in such a way that they have to be aligned also with his interest. Now, I was actually speaking earlier with a journalist that has been covering media policy in Australia for about 20 years. And it was making the point that he always believed that despite Lachlan Murdoch, everybody, in every account and reports about Lachlan would argue that he's very neoconservative and very actually supportive of the current Murdoch agenda as well. But I mean, it would lack, the kind of charisma that his father had, and therefore there would be a radical change there. Well, I mean, I tend to disagree, because I tend actually to look at the reality, and the reality is that the structural power that this company have in these countries and in Australia, especially, is to a level that it would be almost impossible to challenge the elite consensus. So remember the propaganda model. I think it's one of the best example that we have. When you have a company that has, this level of control over the markets, then the other commercial entities will try to, support the consensus. And this is also why it's so difficult to challenge the consensus. Also, to get back to your point about how do we counter this type of propaganda? How do we counter this type of disinformation? Well, it's very difficult, because so often you see other commercial media outlets not actually taking a completely different perspective, probably because of this incredible consensus of the elites, which is something very real, and you can really feel it. And so I think that actually a structural intervention is really what is needed. But as we discussed for years also within the Media Reform Coalition, I think that there is a policy toolkit that we need to adopt. So it's just not just one policy or a policy concerning caps or a market caps, but again, for example, making sure that we can log and we have evidence and we have transparency about all the meetings between the Murdoch executives and politicians. Anytime there are meetings, they should be recorded. In Australia, for example, we have a huge problem with independent authorities. They're really not completely independent. And we don't hear about this, but because I've been trying to put together this new report on media concentration, I realized that not having the proper communication market reports that Ofcom still does in the UK. I'm not sure if what's going to happen in the future with Ofcom, but you have this kind of reporting, for example, that we don't even have here. So the lack of transparency is astonishing. So there are a lot of structural intervention, I think, that we should do even after the new chairman will govern. So, but this is actually something that I think we should all be fighting for, especially when we have this type of policy windows like we do at this moment in Australia. And we should do this also jointly, because as we can see already, the problems are the same across all the three countries where Murdoch has such a big control.
Thank you, Bene. So it is a deeply structural problem. It's not just about Murdoch, but on the other hand, because it's a structural problem, it's all about Murdoch. So there is a kind of circularity to that. And Rhys, I was really struck in your presentation about what you said about the audience of Fox News and the extent of that, and how much it's increased. And there's a question that comes in that relates to that says, when you say that liberal left journalists need to address style rather than simply the content itself, do you mean that they should adopt a similar type of style?
Well, as I mentioned, I don't have, I'm not wise enough to offer the answer, right, on what liberals or left journalists and media activists should do. But what I'll reiterate is what they've been doing in terms of communication has failed to counter the right's populist hegemonic ascendancy in the last 2 or 3 decades. So, I think we have to go back in history to kind of denaturalize our eyes from seeing these different styles. Today, we associate this tabloid style with conservatives partly because of NewsCorp, right? They've constructed that link over decades. But if you look at the 30s, for example, in America, it was leftists who embraced tabloid media styles. It was leftists who criticized technocratic authority. It was leftists who claimed, lamented media bias, the conservative media bias, right? Socialist news organizations, labor movement news organizations. And so my main point is for the left to expand its kind of political imagination on what's possible in terms of crafting news programming that is appealing to working class people. And so how do you create that culture? How do you shift the way that liberals are coded currently as professional educated class, et cetera? And partly that's the problem of the liberal media in the United States. They've leaned into that conservative mapping of them that Murdoch has done. He's called them the coastal elites, and then they cater to that market, right? So I don't know if I have an exact, I don't have a definitive answer, but what I will say is that tabloid journalism, populism, they do not necessarily have to be conservative, and they do not necessarily have to be mutually exclusive with facts and good reporting. It's a matter of what audience are you trying to speak to, right? And and part of Murdoch's power, and I agree with Justin and everything that's been said here, that the regulatory dimension of this is critical, and the political economic part of it is critical. But if you look at what Rupert Murdoch has done in each different national context, it's a 3-step process, right? He first comes in, and the first step is critical. He has to build an audience first. And once he builds that audience, then he uses it as a political cudgel to put fear in politicians or to get their favor, right? And then once he has that, he moves to the regulatory favors, right? Then he moves to the access that Justin talks about. But we have to remind ourselves, what was the first step that Murdoch got power? It is actually understanding mass taste. He was trained on Fleet Street in London as a sub-editor, as a young man in the 50s. He understood the kind of class logic of these different market sectors in the media industry and how to appeal to them, much like Trump, right? Who was born of privilege, but he also was trained to understand this kind of tabloid style in reality television, in WWE entertainment, wrestling, and the tabloid press in New York. So I think style it's not the answer, but I think it helps expand our tools, right, in interacting this.
I think that's a really important point. And it kind of links in and back to just how it's possible for News UK to get that first foothold, and people saying, look, we should wait and see what they do before we criticize it, is actually that point is, well, as soon as you get that foothold and the door is open, and then we allow the kind of infiltration of political culture and conversation to happen immediately, and then suddenly the entire media environment shifts in that direction because they're all chasing those audiences in a particular way. And so this brings us back actually to your issue around Ofcom, Justin, in the UK. And if they have granted the license now to Murdoch for his news channel, are they fit for purpose? Should we be looking elsewhere? Should we be campaigning for another form of media regulation? Has Ofcom now failed in its duty?
I think the problems with Ofcom really go back to its establishment after the 2003 Communications Act, and I think Des Friedman talked about this in his book, Politics and Media Policy, but there really were quite endemic problems in the way that the new converged media regulator was set up, which meant that it was essentially set up to fail in the sense that it was always going to be institutionalized as an organization that would be vulnerable to exactly the sorts of pressures that have to be confronted by media regulators. Now, it's slightly different to the way that I think politicians are influenced by people like Rupert Murdoch. Ofcom doesn't have quite the same kind of political stake in sort of making sure that the media coverage of Ofcom is favourable. There isn't much media coverage of Ofcom to begin with. The way that it works, I think, with Ofcom is almost a kind of byproduct of an institutionalized culture that means it will always look for the solution that attracts the least heat. You'll always follow the path of least resistance when they're confronted with what are essentially deeply politicized decisions over whether or not, for example, to grant Murdoch a license, whether or not to block a transaction, whether or not to press the point that they raised with the government over the need for regular plurality reviews. And it's easy to understand why time and time again, Ofcom will always end up with the position that is not going to incur the wrath of power. They know that ultimately they would rather be faced with the kind of pressure that's brought to bear by a bunch of whining academics and activists like us than the kind of pressure that's brought to bear by Murdoch's lawyers, who have vast amounts of resources to actually challenge them in the courts and potentially and exert influence over the government that could potentially result in a diminishing of their role and power in the media regulatory environment. That's why I'm not actually massively concerned about whether or not Paul Dacre ends up getting the top job, because I don't think this is about individuals. I think that it goes fundamentally to the way that Ofcom is structured. If we're really serious about changing the media regulation landscape in the UK and anywhere else, we have to look at what is the actual appointment system? What is the method of funding? We have to go back to these fundamental questions. And what do democracies need for regulators that are properly structured to ensure that they have the kind of independence and autonomy that is necessary to take these brave decisions?
Thank you, Just. I think that's a really good place to begin wrapping up. We've got 3 minutes, and I'd like to invite each of the panelists to give me one answer, if you like. What is it that we should be doing in the here and now to actually remove democracy's greatest threat and enter into environments in each of our countries which can better, media environments that can better serve democracy? We've heard different ideas come through, but I want you to privilege one of those, and so that we can get a sense of what we can do, what's possible to do as media reformers in this current context. I'm going to go in reverse order, so I'm going to come to you first, Rhys.
I think the political economic obstacles for creating a left media system are enormous. Like any media project that's critical of capitalism it's going to be an uphill battle. But I still think the strategy to create a news media system, right, that is appealing to a broad base of workers and ordinary people from a leftist point of view is critical. And the question is, how do you create a popular form of journalism and media from a left point of view? And so I see hope in some indie outlets on YouTube and the burgeoning kind of independent native YouTube channels that are adopting more of a populist style, that they're more morally clear in their messaging. They're unapologetic in their ideology, and they recognize that presentation, aesthetics, emotion mobilize people. that they're not necessarily bad things, depending on who's wielding them. And so I think leftists need to think hard about, the style of news that they're crafting, while also recognizing the enormous political, economic, and regulatory challenges, also engaging in that fight as well, those battlefronts as well. But I think that there are strategic positions within the popular culture, within commercial media, that need to be considered in this struggle, right, against the conservative opposition.
Thank you, Reese. Benny.
Well, as you know, I'm all in favor of a set of policy intervention to secure plurality of the media, but I wanted to pick on a question that actually was raised, and probably we didn't address it, because I think that actually it's very crucial. I get asked very often if social media can actually help us addressing these structural issues, and I want to make 2 points. So the first is that, in fact, social media are very often used by, for example, the Murdoch press and commercial media to say that there is no problem with media concentration and there is not a problem of media plurality because we have so many voices represented. And so they get used as an argument against any kind of media regulation or intervention. And the second point I want to make is that actually, if we want to probably address the issue of what kind of style we can embrace to respond to post-truth, to respond to disinformation and this kind of populist right-wing propaganda. Well, I think that actually a structural intervention would be to try and change the surveillance capitalism or data capitalism that is at the basis of the way in which also these social media systems work, because obviously, a system that is only aiming at a purpose, which is to make profit through behavioral surplus and to make profits through clicks on social media, will always favor a logic of gut feeling, a logic of a discourse that doesn't have anything, doesn't have any argument behind. And so, to think also the way in which these new, social media environments have developed, and in a way that is less capitalist, of course, and it's less profit-led. I think that would be a very good structural intervention. And obviously, when we look at the way in which these big tech giants are making money, there is another great opportunity there, because we know that they took away a lot of online advertising from public interest journalism, but we also know that we can still redistribute these resources, and we can redistribute them to local news, to some different kind of structural enterprises of news, such as cooperatives, for example, at the local level, that are managed by the same journalists. And so there are a lot of opportunities, in my view. We should just be given the chance to start.
Thank you, Benny. Justin, final word.
Yeah, I would echo both what Benny and Reese said. I think what this speaks to is that in the struggle for media democracy, we can't pick and choose our battles. We have to be in strategically adaptable and ready to address the whole range of complex issues that are raised by, for example, the proposed new television channel by Murdoch in the UK, as well as the expansion of his interests elsewhere, the way in which Fox gave credibility to what is fundamentally an extreme nationalist ideology in the US. These are things that we need to address on all levels. It's a question of style. It's a question of populist activism. It's a question of building pressure and power above all. And one of the things, just to end on a note of vague optimism, one of the really hopeful, positive things presented by Murdoch's proposed news channel in the UK is that it is an opportunity, a rare opportunity, for us to kind of, as leftists, to reach beyond the kind of ideological polarized boundaries that have so often contained media reform discourse within a very contained sphere, if you like. And I think that is one thing that I would really like to get involved with as much as possible. I think the campaign that was soon to be launched by the Media Reform Coalition and others in challenging this new channel by Murdoch will speak to that. We really need to find these issues where we can actually get conservatives in a room with socialists and say, do you know what? This is a problem for all of us. This is a threat to our fundamental our fundamental democratic rights. And that is the only time in recent history where we've actually been successful in checking Murdoch's constant expanding ambitions of power.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. We are sadly out of time, but I like to end on vague optimism, because I'll take any optimism right now, to be frank. But that's if you have been interested in this discussion, and if you do want to join the campaign for media democracy, then you could start by coming to the Media Democracy Festival, which this year will be held entirely online from the 14th of March for a week. The details of that are in the blurb for this event, so please do look that up. We begin with a keynote speech by Jeremy Corbyn on the 14th of March, and then there are events every day for the week following. I hope you've enjoyed the debate. Please join me in thanking once more our wonderful panelists, and I hope to see you all again very soon. Oh, before we finish, a final thank you to our wonderful co-sponsors, the Byline Times, Now Then Festival of Debate, the Media Fund, Bywire and the Canary. Thank you so much to them. With them, these debates reach a far larger audience, and it's independent media that we really need to ensure have our support. So please go to them and support them as the best way you can. For now, hope to see you all very soon.